Hello and welcome to The View from 22. I'm James Heal and I'm joined today by Dr. Rakib Ehsan, a researcher and author, to discuss the events of the last few days in Southport. Rakib, you've written for Unheard today, saying that the attack on Southport has been exploited by conspiracists. Tell us more.
No, absolutely. Firstly, what we're talking about here is a brutal atrocity where three young girls were ultimately knifed to death at a dance class in the Merseyside seaside town of Southport. But what I'm really concerned about is what's taking place in the aftermath of that stabbing spree. Firstly, I think that the police has been quite reluctant to release crucial bits of information, especially connected to the suspect. Until much later on, we found out that the suspect was of Rwandan origin, but for some time, all we knew that he was a male and he was 17 years of age. And I think what that does, and if you combine that with the general lack of trust in police and public institutions in general, and also the disintegration of effective, independent local reporting, where you have those small town journalists who have their variety of sources who are able to really unpack these admittedly horrific events, they're vanished. They're a relatively scarce resource in modern Britain. And what you have there, you have a dangerous vacuum which is left. And unfortunately, in the era of rapid online communication, especially on social media platforms such as X, you have that vacuum which is filled by extreme disinformation. We also saw anti-Muslim conspiracy theories being peddled, being shared with impunity. One being that the suspect was a Muslim illegal migrant who had entered the UK on a small boat from France. And I think, unfortunately, the issue that I have with that was that Merseyside police, and you see police forces, they're very active on social media nowadays, especially when it comes to indulging in radical progressive activism. But when it comes to fighting these very dangerous forms of disinformation following a horrific event, they're nowhere to be seen.
I mean, that's a great point. Obviously, you've seen social media budgets spiral for the police across the country. On the grounds, of course, they need to communicate rapidly on different platforms where their people in the local communities are. And yet, as you say, it comes to it, and they're taking, almost the entire day to respond to things, to shut things down. So I suppose there's one element of this, which, I mean, I've noticed on your X profile, you talked about how actually the on-the-ground policing has been very good in the last couple of weeks, and the police as an institution have made real efforts to try and rebuild trust and done their best on the ground. But as you say, the kind of command people in the office are actually not responding quickly enough to fill that vacuum and fill that void.
Oh no, absolutely. And we police forces need very sophisticated anti-disinformation units. And I know that there's a great debate about what is disinformation, but we clearly saw unfounded anti-Muslim conspiracy theories being peddled in the aftermath of the Southport stabbing spree. And then we saw in the riots last night a local mosque being attacked. And I think that really shows you that connection between very dangerous forms of online conspiracism and the impact it can have in real life communities. And I think that the police in recent times, they have been criticised, especially the Met. It's been involved in a variety of scandals. But I think that if there's actually one institution that might emerge with greater levels of public support based on events in the last few weeks, it is the police. And we have to remember that many frontline police officers, that they operate under hugely dangerous environments at times, especially yesterday in the riots in Southport, where 39 police officers were injured. I believe one was knocked unconscious, and 3 police dogs were also injured, with 2 having bricks thrown at them. So I think that it's very clear here what we need to have is very serious political leadership, and that includes tackling violence towards our police officers.
Tell us about this disinformation that's being pumped out. How much of it is people kind of promoting an agenda? How much of it is misinformation? And kind of what are the forces at play here in encouraging people to put this stuff out? I mean, is there a financial incentive, for instance?
I think that you make a very good point there in terms of teasing out that difference between disinformation and misinformation. So misinformation essentially is sharing inaccurate information, but not doing so knowingly, believing that it is the truth when in fact it isn't. I think my point is that in right-wing elements of X, I'd go as far as saying far right, there's a certain readiness to believe anti-Muslim conspiracy theories, and not only a readiness to share them, but to also create them. And I think that is a very serious problem. And of course, there may well be a financial incentive, especially if you rack up a certain number of views and clicks. If you hit a certain threshold of engagement, you can benefit from that financially, especially on social media platforms such as X. So I think it's very important that the authorities are aware of that very important difference between disinformation and misinformation. But we also have to be honest here that there is a disinformation industry, one that poses a fundamental threat to social cohesion, where there are financial incentives at play.
Definitely, I think you'll be spot on that, and I think that's probably something that's only increased. I think. Do you think that incidents like this are going to perhaps lead to more calls for regulation from, particularly this new group of Labour MPs, who this is their kind of first incident of a national disaster in the last 3 weeks or so? Do you think there's therefore going to be a greater push for social media regulation, and actually it's probably incumbent on companies like X to take a look at this and clear it up themselves before legislation comes down?
Well, I think that the capacity, or rather the willingness of platforms such as X to self-regulate effectively, I think I'm not so optimistic on that front, if truth be told. But then this is the problem. Traditionally, I'm very supportive of freedom of expression. And that's something that I've written about many times in the past for The Spectator. For example, being very critical of the working definition of Islamophobia, which I consider to be a blasphemy law through the back door. But what we're talking about here, in some cases, are very deliberate efforts to generate anti-Muslim hatred and exploiting an horrific atrocity in order to do that. And I do think there has to be limitations placed on that kind of behavior, which ultimately threatens to create the kind of public disorder we saw last night in Southport. So I think that the government has to be careful. It should try all it can when it comes to protecting freedom of expression, which is a cornerstone of our liberal democracy, but it also has to create an infrastructure essentially to tackle very dangerous forms of disinformation that pose a threat to the stability and security of our local communities.
Sorry to interrupt the show, but if you enjoy what we do here at Spectator TV, then why not subscribe to the magazine as well? If you subscribe today, you get 12 weeks for just £12, plus a free £20 John Lewis and Waitrose gift card. You can sign up at spectator.co.uk/TV offer.
I think the interesting thing as well is I think there's a danger perhaps we be a bit blasé about disinformation. We think it's just an online thing, a Twitter thing, Twitter isn't the real world, etc. But what was fascinating and deeply disturbing, obviously, was how that kind of online phenomena, these outright lies that were spread on there, then on Monday night, then transpired into the action on Tuesday, which we saw the vigil being hijacked by these parasites, people from outside the town, it seems, outside the community who came in. And actually, I'd be fascinated to get your thoughts on that kind of interplay between online phenomena and offline factors, where actually you then end up seeing a mosque and a police car being petrol bombed.
No, absolutely. And I think we make the point that the suspect is, it's been revealed, albeit that revelation was quite slow, that the suspect is of Rwandan origin. Rwanda is a country which has where only 2% of the population is Muslim. And it's now been decided that there are currently no known links to Islam regarding the suspect. So I think that when you're talking about that interplay between online conspiracy theories and what takes place in real life in our local communities, I don't think we should underestimate the power of that connection, especially when tensions are running high. And the reality is, when a brutal atrocity like this takes place, there are some people who are very eager to place the blame somewhere. That's the truth of it. And I think that more generally, though, we have to be honest about this situation in Southport. I think that the public authorities, when these kind of events take place, these horrific events take place, I think that there's a tendency to manage them through the lens of community relations control. People's emotions need to be managed. And I think that the right balance to strike is being very honest with the majority of the British public, who can be trusted to behave responsibly, even when they receive critical information over events which are decidedly horrific in nature, but also making sure that extremists and agitators, including out-of-town troublemakers who clearly caused a great deal of destruction and also are responsible for various kinds of violent behaviour towards police officers, that those elements are tackled. I think that's the right balance to strike.
I mean, I find it frustrating as a journalist dealing with the police a lot of the time because there is this vacuum, there's this wall of silence. I think that, obviously the kind of media practices that went on 20 years ago, pre-Leveson, a lot of that was wrong in sort of payment to public officials. But equally, it seems very striking to me that sometimes, not necessarily in this case, but police forces seem more concerned with their own reputation management and trying to sort of clamp down on anything that journalists get a steer on and report misconduct, for instance, than actually trying to deal with some of these things. I mean, I think, as you say, the delayed response to this could have helped prevent some of this misinformation, disinformation, encouraging that. What I would say is also, watching, for instance, I was on GB News this morning and listening to what the reporter who was on the scene had to say there was interesting. She was there at the clear up at sort of 6:05 in the morning, and the community there was encouraging sort of picking up the debris from last night, already taking away that carcass of the police car. And for me, that was what was so striking, was the difference between the organised rabble of people who came in yesterday and who were laughing and jeering after the vigil, which suggests to me they weren't obviously taking part in the spirit in which it was intended, and then the organic nature of this morning, the phenomenon where local people were coming of their own will and doing that at sort of grassroots level. I think that was quite a striking contrast, and perhaps showed really kind of which of these was a more natural expression of the feelings of the local community.
No, absolutely. And the local residents who are reeling from a horrific atrocity in their usually very quiet and peaceful seaside town, they woke up this morning, they pulled themselves together, and they cleaned up much of the destruction which took place from last night. For me, they're the very best of Britain, in my view. But I don't think that we should ignore what happened last night. And I think that what Merseyside Police, what they've talked about there, is many out-of-town troublemakers, some connected to the English Defence League. They ultimately besmirched the memory of the 3 young girls who were brutally murdered in Southport. These are people who framed themselves as patriots, people of community spirit. I didn't see much of that at all last night. And it tends to be the very same people who talk about respect for the rule of law. In my view, there wasn't much of that last night either, by the looks of it. So I think that some of those people need to have a long, hard look in the mirror. And I think that more generally, moving forwards, we have to be realistic about the possibilities of these kind of disorders taking place after such horrific events. And that also means robust action in the online space, where a great deal of extreme disinformation may be spread between digital communities there.
I think we can all agree on that, Rakib. Thank you very much for joining us today on Spectator TV to discuss this.
Thank you.